Okay. I'm going to wait a moment to see what it actually says before I get going this time. For those of you who are just seeing this, seeing the recording, or just hopping on now, I ran into a bit of technical trouble with the live streaming, and it said that I had jumped ahead about 12 minutes when I started. Oh, and it's still struggling. Okay. All right. All right, good. And hop over here so I'm not looking at things I don't need to be looking at. All right. All right, now I think we can go. That was more complicated than I'd expected. Let me just settle back in before I get started. All right, so as I was starting to say, so I watched some videos this morning from a YouTube channel called Climate Town. This is a climate science graduate student who's putting together like research comedy. They're quite entertaining. And if I remember right, the student's name is, I think it was Robin Williams. Like unrelated to the actor. I was just really struck by, did I hear that name right? But anyway, so in there he has some really well-researched, well put together bits of info about like the history of climate science and climate politics and where we are now and why people are saying the things they are, and even commented on some of the recent things going on with Texas. And there's a particular thread in it that I caught because it seemed simultaneously essential to and out of place in what he was saying. Like a lot of what he was saying was, oh, here's this situation, and here, like the main video I just forwarded to my parents was looking at plastic recycling and the way that the plastic recycling symbols, the things that'll have the thing that looks like a recycling symbol but has a number on the inside, apparently that was a bit of propaganda meant to get people to think less about the impact of plastic on the environment and to feel like, well, if I put it in the recycling, then that means I'm doing something. And he was highlighting how, for the most part, the answer is no, that's actually not doing anything. But it's absolving awareness in a very particular way. So like that's interesting, and it's consistent with my understanding of how psychology and economics work. And the kind of lobbying that he talks about in that video and also in a couple of others has this flavor like oil companies are these corrupt monsters that only care about profit. I don't know if he was intending to convey that, if that was just something that I was projecting into what he was saying. But there's this thread that I've encountered a lot, where I encountered this in the phrases like fighting for a cause. What does it mean to fight for a cause? Well, it's like you have to have a battle. Right? So this framing strikes me because there's a process that's syncing up in me where I have a lot of clarity around a whole lot of it, and I can see very clearly, oh, there's actually just a lot of confusion here, a lot of unnecessary confusion that creates a sort of people not knowing what they're doing and creating more of the problem that they think that they are solving in their efforts to solve it. That is almost all activism, almost all efforts to create change in the world fall under a domain where it will systematically create the same problems. Not necessarily exactly the problem they're working on. And fighting for people to have clean drinking water probably isn't going to cause people to have less clean drinking water. But the reason why clean drinking water isn't a universal is coming from a way of orienting to the system as a whole. And the act of fighting encourages the same way of relating to the system as a whole, the same kind of fragmentation. A very simple way to see this is that if there's a me versus them or us versus them, there's a barrier that is the fragment. It's the split. And that split means that in the act of fighting, there isn't intrinsically as much care for the experience of the enemy or the opponent or the people who seem to be getting in the way of what is obviously the good, the villains. And that split means that whatever system creates the villains becomes something that you don't, there's less of a drive to understand. So like in these climate videos, it's a beautiful description of, oh, here are the actual points, here are the video clips of people from back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Here's the newspaper clippings. Here's the memos from these different companies describing these properties. I'm like, okay, well, this is very thorough. And there's this quality of something like, well, because they were grabbing for money, almost like an accusation. Now, I want to emphasize again that this is about me, right? But this is what I perceive and what this fellow was saying. It's a thread type that I've encountered a lot. So whether he intended to put it in there or not, I see this a lot, and I certainly, like that pattern, the perception for that exists in me. So I'm using this as an example, perhaps unfairly to him, and so consider it as my projection. There's a thread that has some sort of element like, almost like a pressure of these people or this organization is morally corrupt and needs pressure in order to morally align. But it's ignoring the question, why? Why is there moral corruption? Why, in some of his examples, why is Exxon being practically villainous when it comes to dealing with issues of climate change? Okay, it's not particular to Exxon, it's like the whole oil industry, but there's a question of, well, what's the actual cause of the behavior? What is the incentive? Even if you posit that there are psychopathic monsters who build companies that end up having all of this power and money, why? What made them psychopaths? What caused them to build the company? Why did the company succeed so well? What were all of these factors such that success could become so discorrelated with what is sane? Now, I want to highlight how this point holds even if you are skeptical of climate science. What I'm looking at is a reasoning process, or a kind of gap in a reasoning process that's almost universal. How do we relate to causes that we fight for and villains? And I feel a bit of uncertainty for myself. There's an enormous amount of clarity. I feel some sense of 90% clarity on this. Like there's something that if I iterate a few times, I suspect I could chunk this down. Sort of like an awful lot of it falls into the domain of a simple phrase, a simple concept of if you are getting a tremendous amount of meaning or value from fighting for a certain thing to happen or fighting against a particular villain or villainous force, then you dare not win. I think that captures a tremendous amount of this, but it's not the whole thing. It's not the whole thing. I also want to emphasize there's this 10% that I work with that I'm confused about. There's something of, well, there's not a lot of global consideration. If somebody attacks one of my family members, I just break the attacker's arm. Or like I do what I need to protect my family, and I care less about the attacker than I do about my family member. That's true. It seems weird not to. sort of like, I don't know, if a mosquito lands on my skin, I'm much more concerned about getting the mosquito off of my skin than I am with the mosquito's health or the mosquito's ability to eat. This feels very clear to me. I don't feel very conflicted about it. I'm confused about how this philosophically relates to universal compassion, but that's a mental confusion. In terms of what caring means, yeah, I care about some forms more than others. That's just true. Maybe that's a spiritual flaw, but I don't know what it would mean to correct it. It just seems insane. It seems to destroy what value even means. So but I feel into this. I track how there are some things that some boundaries I draw, some things I want to fight for, but they're not concepts. Right? So there's a particular zone where I have enormous clarity. I want to explore this a little bit. I'll offer a little bit about this here. There's for me a lot of there's a lot of ease in being able to recognize that there are entities on multiple levels of existence, multiple kinds of intelligence. This can sound kind of wonky or crazy, but it's actually very practical. If we want to pretend that a cat has intelligence, or if we want to pretend that there is something that we might want to call intelligence in slime mold, this is kind of a curious example, but if you search stuff on slime mold, it's a lot more clever than you might think. It can actually outsmart, if I remember right, it outsmarts ant colonies in certain cases. And we can sort of imagine that there's something that we would want to fairly call intelligence about those. We can also view there as being intelligence in our computers. We created it as an artificial intelligence of a sort. But it's fair. It's fair to say, I mean, we know it's a simplification, but to talk about how, yeah, I guess my computer just didn't want to run that program. It just kept crashing it. I had to convince it by going and adjusting some of the files so that it would be able to find them. As though I'm talking about an entity. Well, the same thing is true when you're looking at me and there's an impression that there's a person here. What gives you that impression? Right, there's a kind of assumption that's made. There's a gut level sense of it's obviously correct. Like that's what an entity even is. If you can't use that concept with people, what are we talking about? So I mean this on a very practical level. I don't mean there's some sort of strange alternative existence to track. I mean, there is a different level, but it's a different level the same way that you don't understand the feel of jazz or the feel of classical music or the feel of pop or hip hop. Like you don't understand the feel of those by analyzing the sound waves and looking at the frequencies and isolating the notes. You can, but that isn't where the recognition of the feeling comes from. It's on a different level than what you physically hear. It's a more subtle level. So the same level at which there's a subtle feeling of what the music is, there are things that I think are fair to call entities. And people, Eckhart Tolle talks about this. He'll talk about how there are pain bodies, and like pain bodies stay dormant and they sleep and they sort of awaken in order to feed. This is the experience of, I don't know what came over me. And there are these collective pain bodies. So you see this in like mobs, the way that a mob will have a collective kind of intelligence or a collective entity-ness of some sort. And, memes have an entity-like nature to them. Memes, most memes have this sort of almost a bacteria level of intelligence, like a joke. what makes a joke survive is that it convinces its host to retell it. One way to convince the host to retell it is by having it be really funny and create this impulse in terms of the social desire to share, to go and tell other people, like to share the humor with other people. Another way is for it to be incredibly offensive, right? Or for it to be really sticky. One of the stickiest memes, I don't know how successful this is at spreading, but for me, one that just pops up, it goes from dormancy to active every time anybody mentions vacuuming anything. There's this, vacuums suck. It's such a stupid joke based on a pun, but now every time it sort of happens in my head, and there's almost this eye rolling effect of, okay, yes, that's happening in me. But there are harder to trace examples of these sort of uprisings in interactions, like the transgenerational traumas, like transgenerational alcoholism is an example where there's this pattern that gets transmitted. So what is getting transmitted? Some sort of pattern that has a kind of life cycle. Okay. So, languages actually are another example of this. Languages are a kind of entity in a way of speaking about it. Speaking. When I'm pouring energy a little too quickly into my mind. Give me a moment. This is a domain that I can geek out on. There's just a million examples of this. The point of thinking of these things as entities is that it's helpful to be able to use the kind of social thinking that we use for each other for these sorts of different kinds of beings. The same way that it's helpful to think of pets as beings rather than as machines. And we have cats that live here, and it's helpful to think of cats as having a kind of intelligence, as opposed to being robots, biological robots that we feed and pet because the sensations are good and we enjoy the purring sound, and it is funny to watch them scrabble around. Part of the enjoyment is the projection of an internal experience, in a sense, an experience of there being shared moments. Earlier, as I was coming up the stairs to do this recording, encountered one of our more spacey cats, and I was just standing on the stair, sort of staring at the wall. I sort of leaned down and petted him a few times on his head, and he looked up at me and did the kitty. And there's like, it's in cat language, is this, I really like you, I am happy. Of course, I'm projecting that. Maybe accurately, the same way I project an impression that when I hear words from other humans that I'm understanding something about what they mean, that they're trying to communicate. It's a projection of a sort. So there's this sense of a shared experience there that I have to break down and analyze in order to experience as something else. So in this same way, we're dealing with a lot of entities that are more subtle than the physical level. These memes and these forces, we see this as like, what is Black Lives Matter? Black Lives Matter isn't a physical thing. It is a living energy at a more subtle level. It has an intention to move. It has a direction. And it employs people. This isn't unique to Black Lives Matter. This is just what type of thing we're talking about. So there's a problem is not quite the right word. There's a puzzle. When you look at something like this fellow I was talking about at the beginning, from the Climate Town YouTube, is ending a lot of his videos with this sense of, like, it's really important that you get involved, you get informed, you engage in these things, put pressure on politicians, you you really speak up about this stuff, because we've got to speak up about this. There's a structural problem with approaches like that. The structural problem is, even when those are correct, even when they are technically correct, when they're describing all the facts correctly, like let's just grant for a moment that this fellow's right, that the world is coming to a crash and burn, emphasis on burn, and that the powers that be currently are set up so that we are in something like an economic and power gridlock that prevents the ability to take climate science seriously, and that there is an active incentive to create disinformation so that we never change our public collective attitude about this until it's too late. And that the only way to deal with this is to create something that's basically a grassroots effort to get people galvanized into creating a real change. Let's suppose all of that's true. Also, I don't know if all of that is quite what he's saying. It was just an impression. I encountered it for the first time this morning. I don't know this fellow. But there's a real challenge here, in that the proposed method of solving it is based on essentially leaning into, like offering your life force, offering your vitality in service of one of these entities. In this case, this is some sort of like what in Western esotericism would be called an egregore, a sort of large-scale thought form. This movement of like the sort of neo-pseudo religion that would have Greta Thunberg as one of the saints or prophets. Right? So this energy, this sort of field where it can cause people to feel this sense of meaningfulness, can move their hearts and move their mouths and create passion and a sense of, look, well, we have something to fight for, and we have beings to fight against. Who are you fighting against? Oh, you're fighting against the entities that incarnate, or in legal terms, the word is incorporate, corpus, like corpse. You're incorporating, which is to say you are coming into a body. The whole legal structure, the intuition behind a corporation, is that it is embodied. It is the embodiment of a legal structure, so that you have some sort of legal thing that can now legally be considered a person for some purposes. That's what incorporation is about. And a corporation is it's one of these entities incarnated or incorporated. So the suggestion is basically to become a vessel for one minor deity in order to fight another minor deity. I'm saying deity to describe something about, like, I'm calling these, I'm just using deity as sort of a gesture towards this sort of entity-like nature, but the fact that the nature of the entity is fundamentally not physical. It is informational, it is behavioral, it is energetic. So there is this kind of clash that is proposed. Let's you and me fight, but the you and the me, this is where the us versus them is coming from. It has to do with when one of these egregores, when one of these large-scale structures has you, it doesn't feel like it has you, it feels like you see what's true. QAnon is another example. People who get really into, or got really into, I don't know how dead this thing is now, but the whole QAnon movement was one of these entities becoming virulent and expanding its power into the minds and bodies of all of these different people. And there's an effort to, it didn't have much to do exactly. And then there was this whole question of I think now everybody's calling it the insurrection on the 6th, January 6th. So, I think it was the 6th. My sense of dates is a little off there. The problem is that this is just taking conflict on the human level and putting it one level of abstraction up. Even if the climate egregore, the we need to deal with climate change egregore, is correct, and there is, like, its information, its content is correct, we can't ignore the fact that the proposed mechanism is to let the egregore possess us and use the possession in order to fight those who are possessed by a different egregore. Right now, what's defining the state of the world is exactly this kind of war. And it is a battle between non-physical entities that are very large and very dispersed. There's many, many, many of them. It is a global war. Well, there is a solution, but it's the same solution as when I experience this, this uprising of, how dare you? Well, how do I relate to the how dare you energy? How do I relate to the other? Are they suddenly a villain? It's worth noticing there are no villains in reality. There are only villains in stories, which means if I see a villain, that means I'm living in a story. This is not just wordplay. This is actually quite important. It's very true. It's this sense of whatever causes somebody to be acting horrendously, there is a cause to it. And if my only response to those causes is to condemn them, then I am cutting myself off from being in contact with the truth that is driving them. There is a level, so if we think of, there's a physical level, and then there's this more subtle level that these egregores live on. And you can think of this as a metaphor if you like, that's fine. Thinking of it as there being a level at which we experience the being touched by and moved by music. It seems fine to call that a metaphor if we have to. But the direct experience is there is a way of being touched. There's a way of being moved. There's a way of being convinced. It feels like something to really believe in something. But there are levels above those, above, like, more subtle than, more causal than. Like, the subtle level controls what happens on the physical level for the most part. Like, there's some oversimplifications there, but not many. Not many. What causes me to interact with my partner is dominated almost entirely by what's above that, rather than, am I hungry? Because even if I am hungry, how I relate to the hunger is a matter of how my relationship to subtle forces arises. Does hunger cause me to have a sense of, I'm feeling hungry? Or does it summon, why are you always bad? Like, like what causes one versus the other? That's the subtle relationship. So if I want to transform how I react in my relationship, I need to change my way of my configuration at the more subtle level. And which egregores get to possess me, if any? But who am I if all of this subtle stuff is possessing me? Well, there is, yeah, the hangry sensation. Nicholas mentions that. Yep. But there is a level above that. I think I think that it's actually helpful to think of at least two above. But a very simple way of orienting to it is, well, I'm here experiencing the upset or the offense or the strong, fiery agreement. So I'm outside of it. Whatever thoughts I think, I am thinking them, I'm experiencing them. So I can see the thoughts, so I am before them. I am outside of them. feeling into a bit of a time crunch here and sorting out how this has felt for me, engaging with this, trying to play with an edge, but also trying to share something of a bit of clarity here. What does it mean to track these entities at different levels? I would invite you, if you feel passionate about a cause, to track what is it that makes you feel passionate about it? When does the passion stir? What triggers the passion? When does the passion feed? And what does it feed on? Imagine that that passion is a kind of entity. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. It doesn't mean that the cause is wrong, but it does mean that the thoughts about why the cause is right are probably part of how the entity is shaping your mind and shaping how your attention moves. If you can pay a lot more attention to that, if you can come to notice it, then there's a lot more room to see this entire global war of the egregores from above rather than from within. And it becomes a lot more obvious what to do about it. Hint, it has almost nothing to do with convincing other people to do anything. I forget that a lot. I forget that energetically a lot. This is one of the things that I am trying to weed out of my heart. Okay, I'm going to close it there. Thank you for listening.